Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from AnthonyMorganti.com. In this video, I'm going to give a review and or recap of my video series, I Critique and Process Your Image. Now, judging by some of the recent comments I've been receiving and my own feelings, I found that I've been repeating myself several times over the last several videos, so I'm beginning to think that this series may have run its course. I really haven't decided yet though, but I thought it would be fitting that at least at this point, we pause for a second and we recap what we've covered so far in those previous videos and kind of sum it up here. And if you're interested in a lot of these topics I always talk about, this might be a video that kind of lists everything and you could do some more research for those topics that interest you. Now, specifically, a lot of times in these videos, I talk about the camera settings that the photographer used. And I mention the exposure triangle all the time. And really all the exposure triangle is how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed relate to one another. And this diagram is a little bit misleading, but what it's trying to tell you is that as your ISO goes up, you will get more noise in your image. But when the ISO goes up, your aperture in number would have to go up. So you're going to use a higher aperture number. Your aperture actually gets smaller, and that's where a lot of people get confused about aperture. And shutter speed along the bottom there, that is kind of confusing, but really, I think most of you probably know that if you use a slower shutter speed, you'll tend to get more motion or blurriness in the shot when something is moving through the frame. And if you need to freeze something that is moving, you have to use a fast shutter speed. And what the diagram is showing about aperture is that the smaller aperture number you use, which means a bigger aperture, I know that's always misleading, but the smaller aperture number you use means that you'll have less depth of field. So a smaller number, let's say, is 2.8. You'll have less depth of field at 2.8 than you would have at, let's say, aperture of 11, which is a bigger number. That's what that's trying to convey in this diagram, which I found on the internet. I didn't draw this. Now, if you are interested in really learning about exposure, I recommend this book and I'll have it linked below. It's Understanding Exposure by Brian Peterson. It's a great book and I can't recommend it more highly. So try this book out. This should help you understand those three things in photography that a lot of people get tripped up on: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. All right, the next thing I often talk about is the sweet spot of the lens. And that really has to do with the aperture of the lens. And I often say in the videos that the sweet spot of the lens is 2 to 4 stops up from wide open. Now, when I say up from wide open, I'm talking about a higher number. So if you're using a lens that is an f2.8 lens, if you're going to go 2 to 4 stops up from wide open, then f5.6 is 2 stops, f8 is 3, and f11 is 4. So there's 2 to 4 stops up from wide open. Now, that will give you the sharpest image. If you stop down a little too far, meaning you go to f16, f22, the lens usually will start suffering from what they call diffraction. And diffraction really means that it's not going to produce sharp images as sharp as you could. Now, you will get more depth of field, as you can see at the chart at the very bottom. You'll get more depth of field at f22. But what you'll find is, typically, if you stay in that 2 to 4 stop area and you're shooting a landscape, you'll get more than enough depth of field if you focus at the right point, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So f8 is a great aperture to use on most lenses. It's 2 to 4 stops up from wide open on most lenses, and if you focus in the right spot, you'll be able to get a very tightly focused, sharp image from front to back. So talk about, or think about finding your lens's sweet spot, and make sure that when you're shooting, especially landscapes, you want to be 2 to 4 stops up from wide open. Okay, the next thing I always talk about is composition in all these videos, and I always talk about the rules of composition. And I tend to not like to call them rules. I like to call them strong suggestions, but they really do work. And I know a lot of people poo-poo the rules of composition and say rules are made to be broken, but that's fine. If you want to break the rules of composition, at least understand what they are before you go around breaking them. Then you'll be better apt to break them in a way that really makes a compelling image. Now, I often mention two specifically. There's a lot of rules of composition, but two are the most common, and that is the rule of thirds and the golden ratio. And the rule of thirds is simply a grid that is kind of placed over your viewfinder in your mind at the very least. Some cameras will allow you to actually place this grid, an overlay on your viewfinder so you could visually see it and compose the image or the scene properly. But it's just one third, one third, one third. The frame is divided up into thirds horizontally and vertically, and the best point to place something is where one of those lines intersects with another line. So you could see in this image I took here, the lady is walking across the street and I have her head right where two of these lines cross, the horizontal and vertical line. So, this is kind of a perfect rule of thirds type shot. So it's something to think about. And it doesn't matter. You don't have to have her on that upper right hand line. It would work just as well if I had her on the left hand line. And in other things, the lower 2 points of intersection would work too on some other things as well. But you can see, since she's walking, she's standing straight up, I do have her right along the right-hand vertical line, so it's like perfectly aligned there. So just something to think about, rule of thirds. It does work. It's a great compositional rule, and it works very well, and it really makes balanced image that is pleasing to look at. The other one that I talk about a lot is the golden spiral. Now, this is a famous photograph taken by Henri Cartier-Bresson, and the golden spiral rule is here, and you could see it just twirls around, and the person on the bicycle is right at that point where the spiral resolves. So that's another compositional rule that works very well. These compositional rules kind of go back to the ancient Greeks, from my understanding, and they knew what made a balanced painting or a balanced sculpture and things like that, and they incorporated these rules in their art. And it just is something the way our brain as human beings is wired that makes these types of rules make an image pleasing to look at. So keep these in mind. The other thing I talked about is compositional aids or composition aids. And these are a little like not necessarily full rules of composition. These are just things that help along your image. And they're leading lines, and leading lines will include parallel lines and receding lines. And something that's a little more powerful than just a normal leading line is a diagonal line. That's something that comes up from the corners of the image, either the upper corners or the lower corners, but it's just a natural line. It could be a path, a walkway. It could be just, telephone lines, wires, power lines, I should say, things like that. So these diagonal lines work. And they could be hard diagonal lines, like an actual road that is coming through the scene from the corner of the frame, or what I call soft diagonal lines. It could be just the way the ripples of the water are on a beach and they're kind of rippling diagonally through the frame, something like that. So things to look for, those are very strong composition aids. Framing. Framing is what it means. Something is naturally framing the subject in the image. Now, it could be like shooting through a keyhole, you're perfectly framing the shot, or shooting through a window and there's a cat in the window, you're framing the cat with the window. It could be something a little more subtle. It could be a beach scene and you have a palm tree on the left and a palm tree on the right and a sailboat in the middle in the water. So that's framing also. Visual weight is a little harder, I found, for my students to get their head around, but it's something usually, in very general terms, that is smaller in the scene, but it commands a lot of our visual attention. And there's different ways to achieve visual weight, and actually it could get a little bit complicated. There's a lot of different ways involving contrast, size, color, and that's something you really should Google and check into. Visual weight is a very powerful composition aid and something to think about. And kind of going along with visual weight is symmetry and near symmetry, what I call near symmetry. Symmetry I mentioned in a video, in one of the previous videos. Let's say you had an array of oranges, and I don't remember what array I mentioned, but let's just say it's a 10 by 8 array of oranges. So you have 80 oranges, and they're all side by side, one over the other. So you have this perfect symmetry of these oranges. Well, if you take one orange out and put in a red tomato, then you have near symmetry. And that is a type of visual weight also, because you have this frame full of oranges, but you have one tomato in there. So that's another very strong composition aid that you should look for and see if it's something you could capture. The other thing is I have a hard time sometimes getting through to a lot of newer photographers. When you take a landscape image, the landscape image usually will be better if it has a focal point. It needs a point of resolution, something for our eyes to resolve on. So if you have this beautiful beach scene that I mentioned before, and you have palm trees and stuff, but if you didn't have that sailboat in there, there's nothing there for us to resolve upon. So get something in there. Very strong focal points are people. So if you could have a person in the shot, and if you could incorporate also a leading line leading up to that person, and if that leading line happens to be a diagonal line leading to that person, and that person happens to be at a point of intersection of rule of thirds, then you'll have a super strong composition. So there's things to look at. And it's something for the viewer, whenever anyone looks at our images, they don't like generally to have their eyes bounce all around the image. They like you as a photographer to lead them through the image, and you need these visual clues and these diagonal lines, leading lines, framing. All this stuff helps lead the person through the image. But finally, the payoff is when their eyes resolve on something. So it's always good to have a focal point in there if possible. And really don't underestimate the focal point. It really will make a good image great. You could have the most beautiful sunset in the world, most beautiful scene, whatever, the trees, the beach, whatever it is. It'll almost always be better if you could get something in there that actually has the viewer's eyes resolve on it, and that something often is a person. So I just want you to think of that. The other thing I always talk about in these videos is where to focus. Now, we didn't have an opportunity to do a portrait because I required that if anyone sent me a portrait, I would need a model release, and that's just only fair. I'm sure people don't want their picture seen by thousands of people unless they get permission. And for legal reasons, I think it's the right thing to do. So I didn't receive really any portraits. But if you do have a person and you're photographing them, the proper way to focus is to focus on the person's eye. And that's true for anything with an eye. It could be an animal, it could be a statue, it could be a painting if you're photographing a painting. Photograph on the eye. And if both eyes aren't on the same plane, meaning if they're turned maybe 3/4 to the side and one eye is closer to the camera than the other eye, you would focus on the closest eye. Also, if it's a group, you generally would focus on the person whose eye is closest. And make sure you use a small enough aperture, that would be an aperture with a larger number, so that you get everyone in focus from the front person to the back person. Now, one little caveat to that, you usually focus on the closer person. But if there is a child in the shot, you tend to focus on the child pretty much wherever they might be in the scene. So if mom is, let's say there's a family and mom is the front person and dad is over mom's right shoulder, and he's holding a child, and the child is to his right slightly. So you have them right in a line, but mom is a little closer to the camera. Generally, you wouldn't focus on mom, you would focus on the child. It's really up to you, and that's another creative decision that you could make. Now, as far as landscapes, um, there's a lot of discourse and a lot of disagreement about how to focus for a landscape. And I want you to really experiment and see what works best for you. The most common ways, and there's many ways, but the most common ways is if there is a focal point in that landscape, focus on that no matter what. Just focus on that focal point because that's what people are going to look at. And that's generally what I will do. Something is important in that frame, even though it's a landscape image, and I want people to notice everything from the very front to the very back. I will focus on something that is the focal point. The other way is you focus about a third of the way up in the scene, and you just literally will divide the scene into thirds with horizontal lines, and that lower horizontal line, that's 1/3 of the way up, and you would focus on something that's in that 1/3 of the way up. Focus there. And the other way is hyperfocal distance. And the way you would do that is you usually used to use charts, and there's still charts out there actually I found, but usually use a smartphone, and there's apps for this. And you would put in the focal length of your lens and the aperture you're shooting at. And the app will return the distance you should focus at, and that is called the hyperfocal distance, and that will give you the maximum depth of field for the shot. It works beautifully, but I found that it's not practical to use because a lot of times they'll give you, I mentioned like, a 3 meter, 3.2 meters, and you need something to measure out 3.2 meters. I mean, if you're really good in your head at estimating how far 3.2 meters is, then you're good, then do that. If not, you're going to need something to measure it. Now, somebody posted in the comments, well, you don't have to be exact. You just have to be around 3. Well, I agree with you. You don't have to be exact. It still works decently if you're around 3.2 meters. But still, like especially me, I really don't have a good estimation of 3 meters. I might think I do, but I don't have something that I feel comfortable would be close enough to be good enough for shooting a hyperfocal type shot. So I would feel you'd have to measure it out. And if you measure it out, there might not be something in the frame 3.2 meters away for you to focus on. So you will have to have something in the frame temporarily to focus on. Stand there or have a friend stand there so you could focus on them, or put a camera bag there at that point, that exact distance, or at least near that distance, focus on it, recompose, and you're good to go. Now it does, again, it does work great, and if it works for you, by all means use it. To me, it's not practical, and I'd rather focus on the subject in the frame. And when I can't, or there isn't a strong subject in the frame, a third of the way up works for me, and that's what I would prefer to do. So, so that's really the main things I covered in these videos, and I'd like to thank everyone for watching these videos and all my videos, really. I do appreciate it. And like I said, I'm not 100% sure I'm going to continue. Uh, you know, I'm open to suggestions. I kind of drifted away from my main motive when I started it. I wanted to show you at least how one professional photographer processes image. That was the main thing. The critique part is pretty standard, but I wanted to just show you how I specifically will process an image. And a lot of people didn't want me to use plugins, and other people wanted me to use plugins. So I tried to satisfy everybody. So I tried to process images all the way in Lightroom, as though I was never going to use a plugin, and then try to backtrack a little and process that same image as I would have done it. And I kind of lost focus along the way. And to tell you the truth, I think in the last video, the video before, like I missed a couple obvious things, and people pointed out, like something very bright that was annoying I should have caught. But I got so pigeonholed in my thinking of what I was going to do, I didn't really evaluate the image properly. So that's part of the reason too. I'm thinking that this video series might have ran its course because I kind of lost focus. But we'll see what we do and what everyone suggests, and we'll go from there. So thank you again, everyone. I really do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.